So welcome to those who have just joined us via YouTube, either now live or later when you watch this program. So you know, I'll be giving a talk titled Christmas from the Secular to the Spiritual, and that will be followed by a talk by Pravrajika Gayatriprana. Every year, in the weeks leading up to Christmas, church figures and others, where's that coming from? Church figures and others lament the commercialization of Christmas. And as we know, we have these hectic shopping sprees for presents and food and drink. And then we have a veritable outbreak of office and private parties full of feasting and hilarity. And what bothers people is it seems like there's a lack of acknowledging and reflecting on the significance of Christmas. Then, of course, we always hear about the pressures that come with Christmas. What to cook, what gifts to buy, and for whom. Is the Christmas card list up to date? Who to invite for the big Christmas lunch? Who's going to host the Christmas lunch? And then it goes further. You hear about these extended family gatherings and sometimes how that can lead to awkward social situations. Not everybody necessarily gets on with everybody else in the family. And there'll be all kinds of characters you need to adjust to, the eccentric uncle, the know-it-all cousin, the obsessive aunt, the opinionated brother-in-law, the boastful sibling, and so on. And there's a lot of joking about that afterwards. But with all of that, given all these pressures and expectations, Christmas is a happy time of year, especially for children. And it's a time for holidays and quality time with the family, a time to slow down and to even spread some goodwill and cheer to others. And even in the so-called secular times that we live in, without COVID-19 afflicting us, the churches are going to be full to overflowing. There are many people who are going to focus on the reason for the season. I've grown up in a secular family, so I've got to admit we only gave a passing acknowledgement to that reason for the season. But still, I think my most treasured childhood memories are or do revolve around Christmas time. And in our lounge room, I remember we keep our bowls of nuts and dried fruits and chocolates, and we'd have a stream of visiting friends and family coming to see us around Christmas time. Leading up to Christmas, the teachers in school would guide us in making our own Christmas decorations. And I used to be quite proud. I had all these coloured strips of paper linked together to form chains, and I'd hang them up from the ceiling in my room. So all this is quite magical for a child. And of course, the house itself, in our lounge room, living areas, we'd have a lot of tinsel hanging, lots of decorations here and there. And the main attraction, of course, would be the Christmas tree. And I'm looking back at it now. It was like a brightly coloured shrine, and the way I related to it was a bit like a shrine. And it was so magical. We'd decorated with cotton wool, artificial snow, so to say, and tinsel and baubles, and I'd be the youngest in the family. I'd be there just waiting for the hint of darkness to turn the lights on as soon as I could. And I can remember just sitting there, a great devotee of the Christmas tree, sitting there in front of it. Of course, I had ulterior motives because as Christmas approached, or the Christmas Day approached, there'd be a growing stack of presents there under the tree because everybody's giving everybody else presents in the family. And I'd sit there obsessing about who's getting what from whom, what could be inside all these brightly colored parcels. So look, it's just an incredibly magical time. You treasure that. And then, of course, in the wider community, as we see, there's a special feeling there. You've got the carols by candlelight, a bit subdued this year, and suburban streets with Christmas lights everywhere, and neighbours closing streets for shared celebrations. So with all of that, whatever it be, secular or not, everybody's touched by the Christmas spirit, for sure. But enough about that. Let's move from the secular to the spiritual. And in the scattered details of the life of Jesus Christ, we read that he spent time in the wilderness, living like a hermit, at least for a short time. 40 days, they used to say, he would spend in the wilderness. And so in the early days of Christianity, following his lead, we know there were actually thousands who uprooted themselves from worldly comforts and distractions of the towns, and they went to live in caves and really lived like yogis, throwing themselves into austerities. In his book, Hermits, The Insights of Solitude, Peter France gives us a glimpse into the lives and teachings of these ascetics. And I'm particularly fond of this book because he did even devote a whole chapter to Sri Ramakrishna. But so one chapter he's focusing on the Desert Fathers, and this is going back to the 3rd century, and they were living near, they had come from some very prosperous towns that had grown prosperous because they were living near the Nile, and the dark, fertile soil along the Nile really did lead to a pretty good lifestyle for people back in those times. But these Desert Fathers, they following the example of Jesus, they turned their backs on this various prosperous, luxurious style that was on offer there. And as it's described, they went out instead into the waste of the howling wilderness, because of course there's desert area near the Nile. And some took to living in caves, and others created simple huts of stone with a roof made of branches. And their only furnishings would be a reed stool and a reed mat for sleeping, and a sheepskin, no doubt to keep them warm because of the cold in the desert nighttime. And they just have a lamp or a candlestick, some brackish water, and some jars of brackish water and oil. And their diet would consist of dried peas and lentils seasoned with wild herbs. So, very, very austere lifestyle. And in those conditions, apparently thousands, not just a handful, not just hundreds, but there were thousands of men and women going to live in solitude or small groups for years. That's quite amazing to think about that back then, how many were so inspired by the life of Jesus. And just as you find in India, the most noted of them would be sought out by the inhabitants of the nearby towns and villages. They'd come to visit these hermits and seek guidance for their spiritual and secular life. But interestingly, some of the most noted of these hermits, they were a bit disconcerted after some time to find that they were being sought out by the rich and famous of those times. And the very renouncing hermits that they were, they'd find ways to discourage these rich people who they felt no doubt were a bit shallow in their purposes. And there's a couple of examples of that. There was Abbess Simon, hearing of a nobleman approaching him one day. He decided to hurriedly go out and begin pruning a palm tree. And as the nobleman and his party arrived, they shouted, "Old man, where is the anchorite?" And Abbess Simon answered, "There's no anchorite here." So they went away, obviously not recognizing him. And I think that reminds us of the time that Sri Ramakrishna was mistaken for a gardener in the Dakshineswar temple, and somebody was bluntly asking him for where Sri Ramakrishna is. So we can well relate to that. And then on another occasion with this Abbess Simon, a nobleman sent he was a much more pompous nobleman, this one, he sent his servants ahead of him to inform Abbess Simon of his visit. And the servants, very pompously told him, "Abbess, get ready. The nobleman who has heard of you comes for your blessing." And so Abbess Simon said, yes, I'll get ready. So he put on, as the story goes, he put on his parched garment and, taking bread and cheese in his hands, sat at the entrance of his hut, enthusiastically eating. And when the nobleman arrived with his train of followers, he scorned him, saying, "Is this the anchorite we've heard of?" And they turned and went back home. He thought, look at this fellow enjoying himself, stuffing himself with food. This can't be anyone of any value. So went away. This other Simon, he used so in other words, this other Simon, his idea was he was only going to give his time and instructions to those who he felt worthy. And he obviously thought these people were too showy and too shallow. So they were quite strict like that. Now, the hermits, of course, are given much to silence and contemplation. And accordingly, these desert fathers were very aware of the power of words and how words have such power for good or evil. So one of them said, one Abbess Macarius, he used to say that a bad word will make even a good person bad, but a good word will make even a bad person good. So such is the power of words. A brother told Abbess Sissos, "I want to control my heart, but I can't." The abbess replied, "How can we control our hearts when we keep open the door of our mouths?" It's a nice way to put it. Theophile, the archbishop, went one day to Skete, and the brothers asked Abbess Pambo, the venerable old anchorite, "Say a word to the Father so that he can be edified." And the old man said to them, "If he is not edified by my silence, he will not be edified by my words." And that's an interesting observation, and it reminds me of Ramana Maharshi, how people would come and sit before him and he would hardly say anything at all. It was the atmosphere around him that would say so much for those who sat there in the meditation hall. And many reported that they would come with questions, and they'd find in that powerful silence surrounding Ramana Maharshi that their answer, the questions would be answered, or their unsteady mind would be settled and pacified. So I'm imagining this Abbess Pambo, maybe he had that type of spiritual power. Happily, with all these strict observances, these desert fathers didn't lose their sense of humor. They weren't dry, long-faced anchorites. There was a lightness and a brevity there. And that comes out in some of the stories where it shows they've got a very wry and subtle sense of humor. And they did place a great emphasis on humility. And so they had an interesting way of, and this wry sense of humor comes out in the way they deal with the self-righteous. And there's a story which you could title, "Don't Water the Vegetables." It's a very interesting story. So the brothers of a monastic community, because apart from these hermits, there were, amongst all these people who'd gone to live in the desert, some types of more formulated monasteries had started to develop back then. Monastic communities had developed. So the brothers of one monastic community, they went off to visit an anchorite in the desert. And the story goes, he received them with joy. And as is the custom with the hermits, seeing that they were tired, he set a table before them and brought whatever he had for them to eat. And as evening fell, they recited the 12 Psalms, and similarly at night. Then later that night, as the abbess was awake at his vigil, he's praying, he heard these visiting brothers of the monastic community, he heard them saying to each other, a bit scornfully, the anchorites in the desert have a softer life than we do in the communities. So, this hermit heard them saying that. So he decided he's going to teach them a lesson. So in the morning, hearing that they were going to visit another hermit in the neighborhood, a good friend of his, he told these visiting brothers, he said, give my friend the hermit my greetings and tell him not to water the vegetables. That's a kind of a nice little code. So they did. When they went to visit the other hermit, they promptly and obediently told him, "Oh, look, your brother hermit's told us don't water the vegetables," whatever that might mean. So understanding this cryptic message, this hermit kept them working until evening without food. When evening came, he sang the grand office and said, "We will stop there because of you, because you are tired." And he said, "We don't usually eat every day, but because of you, let's eat a little." He brought them dry bread and salt. Then he said, "Because of you, we must have a feast." And he poured a little vinegar onto the salt. As they were about to eat, he got up from the table and began to sing the little office. They've got so many songs and prayers they recite. And he made sure that this went on until the small hours. Then he said to them, "Because of you, we can't perform the whole of our rule. You must eat a little as you have come from afar." They ate a little. The next morning, of course, they wanted to leave, somehow get away from this fellow. But he begged them to stay, saying, "Stay with us a little, at least 3 days, to follow the customs of the desert." But they, seeing that he would not give them leave, slipped away secretly. So that wry sense of humor, he taught them a lesson. And just to conclude, there's another very touching and humorous story about the amazing humility of some of these monks. They were so humble and innocent, not mixing with people, that a couple of them felt a bit guilty, and so as Peter France writes, with hilarious ineptitude, they decided to try and behave like other men. They had no idea, they're so innocent. Let's try to experience what it's like to be these other men who are out there living in the towns and the villages. So the story goes, two brothers who had lived together for many years had never quarreled. So one day the first said, "Let's have a quarrel like men in the world outside do." The second replied, but I don't know how to have a quarrel. That's how innocent they are. So the first said, look, I'll put down a brick between us and I'll say, it's mine. Then you must reply, no, it's mine. And so the quarrel will begin. So they found a brick and they put it between them. And the first said, it's mine. And the second said, no, it's mine. So the first replied, oh, well, then if it's yours, take it. And so they couldn't even manage to have a quarrel and they gave up. So that is really hard to imagine, isn't it? But that's very nice to read that. The fact that shows how spiritually developed they were, how sincere they were. So with that, I'll now call on Pravrajika Gayatriprana to give her talk.
I am going to look into the Lord's Prayer in the light of Vedanta. Prayer is an important part of all religious traditions. In prayer, we are trying to reach out to God. In our life, when we face with problems, we try out external remedies, try to sort it out. But when all the external solutions fail, then we turn to God. When there is no other help, when we turn to God. So most of our prayers are petitionary, seeking help of the higher power to face our problems and difficulties. But we cannot say all. There are people who pray just because they seek God. In the Bhagavad Gita, we see Sri Krishna speaking about 4 types of people who worship God. Those who are in distress, those who are seekers of wealth, those who are seekers of knowledge, and the wise people. And he says all of them are good. All of them are good because they are seeking me. Even though it is for selfish personal purpose, they are seeking me, so they are all good. But the last category, the wise people, they pray because just to realize him, because they love him, they want to love him with more. With this idea, let's look at the Lord's Prayer, which is the most common prayer or well-known prayer among Christians, taught by Jesus. In the Gospel of Matthew, we see Jesus saying the prayer, Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not in temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. So Jesus starts the prayer addressing the Lord as our Father. If we can establish a human relation with God, then it is easy to keep our mind on Him. We know that in Hinduism, we have various types of human relations with God as father, mother, friend, servant, child, or even lover. There is a Sanskrit prayer which says, Tvameva mata cha pita tvameva, tvameva bandhuscha sakha tvameva, tvameva vidya dravinam tvameva, tvameva sarvam mama deva deva. O Lord, you are my father, You are my mother, you are my friend, you are my companion, you are my treasure, you are my wisdom. And then finish by saying, you are my all in all. And this idea is not confined to Hinduism, looking upon God in different human relationships. In Christianity, we have as baby Christ is the new is worshipped. It's a common thing, worshipping baby Christ, and that's the time now we adoring the newborn child. Then we see that Brother Lawrence looked upon himself as the servant of the Lord. And the Catholic nuns are usually referred to as brides of Jesus. So all these human relations we attribute to so that we can approach God in a better way, uh, as closer and with greater earnestness. So here Jesus is asking us to approach God as Father, looking upon him with reverence, trust, and confidence. So Saint Teresa says, beseech him as you would a father. Tell him about your trials. Ask him for a remedy against them. So people don't keep away from their father or mother. They feel close. They can approach them and tell their problems, difficulties, and ask for solutions to this problem. So that's what Jesus is asking. Our Father which art in heaven. Then that's the next part. Which art in heaven. Now he's saying our Father is in heaven. But how do we know whether Father exists or not? How do you know whether God exists or not? Of course, there are philosophers with their arguments and logic try to establish the existence of God. And there are other philosophers with their logic and arguments disprove the existence of God. But actually, what do they prove or disprove? Their idea of God. We cannot, whether we are proving the existence of God or disproving the existence of God, it's only proving or disproving our idea of God, not the existence of God. Whether God exists or not, how do you know? By direct experience. If you experience, then you can say, yes, God exists. That's what we see Narendra asking Sri Ramakrishna when he came. Have you seen God? Well, Sri Ramakrishna said, I see him more clearly than I see you. Then can you deny the existence of God? Because you are experiencing directly. You cannot deny that. Now, where do we look for him? If God exists, where do we look for him? Jesus says, in heaven. And where is that heaven? Heaven is not in space. Heaven is a superior state of consciousness. At present, our ideas are all with worldly thoughts. We have to change our way of thinking, feeling, and willing into a higher mode. So heaven is the place where the Lord resides when the heart is purified by prayer and meditation. Then we can see the presence of God there. So Brother Lawrence says, we must make our heart a spiritual temple wherein we adore him incessantly. He is within us. Seek him not elsewhere. Don't go around looking for God. He is within us. What we do is we go around looking for God everywhere. And in the Vedanta, they give an example like the musk deer. The musk is giving out the fragrance and it is at the navel of the deer. But the deer does not know where the fragrance is coming. It runs around searching for the source of the fragrance, but it is within its body. We are like that. We are going around the whole world searching for God while He is within us. So Saint Augustine says that he sought the Lord in many places, but ultimately found Him within Himself. He is within us. Hallowed be thy name. We see that all the world religions give prominence to the place of name of God, repeating the name of God. Hallowed be thy name. Let your name be hallowed. Let us repeat His name. This repetition of the name of God is a very important spiritual practice. Here, that's what Christ is showing us, the great importance of the repetition of the name of God for the spiritual seeker. In the Gospel of St. John, we see Jesus asking His disciples to pray in His name. He says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, whatsoever ye ask the Father in my name, He will give it to you." So just repeat my name. We see a similar idea given by Sri Ramakrishna. In the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, even he tells M, the recorder, Sri Ramakrishna says, "I am going to Calcutta, you can meet me there. I am going to Balram's house, you come and meet me." For M said yes and then left. But as he reached the gate of the Kali temple, he remembered something and came back. So Sri Ramakrishna asked, "What brings you back?" "That may be," M replied, "that may be the house of a rich man and they may not allow me." Sri Ramakrishna said, "Why would you say that? Just say my name and somebody will bring you in." So here also, give my name. The name of the Lord is so important. So it's in all the traditions we can see this repetition of the name of God. The Psalms says, "O magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt His name together." That shows the Jews or the Hebrews used to repeat the name of God. In the Sufis in Islam have used the repetition of Allah or Ali as a spiritual practice for many long time. The Catholics have Hail Mary, while the Orthodox Church, they have the Jesus prayer repetition. And Hinduism, this repeating the name of God is a very deep-rooted idea. Sri Ramakrishna says, when you chant His name with single-minded devotion, you can see God's form and realize Him. So easy. All you have to do is chant His name with single-minded devotion. That's important. Not simply repeating won't do. Single-minded devotion, you chant, you can realize Him. And Holy Mother says the same thing. You will realize everything by the repetition of God's name. And the reason for this great importance for the repetition of God's name is the fact that the name is identical with the inner principle or essence of the thing named. The name and the honor of the name are inseparable. So when you repeat the name of God, you are actually in the presence of God. But often people think that, repetition of the name of God, that's for simple folk who don't have much intelligence or who can't philosophize or even meditate. But they don't realize that this simple name of repetition of the name of God has great effect, is extremely effective in realization of God. In the way of the pilgrim, we see this statement, but unfortunately, they do not know the secret which is revealed as a result of this mechanical exercise. They do not know how this frequent service of the lips imperceptibly becomes a genuine appeal of the heart. See, we think it's only by just repeating. It's a frequent service of the lips. But it becomes imperceptibly a genuine appeal of the heart, sinks down into the inward life, becomes a delight, becomes, as it were, natural to the soul, bringing it light and nourishment and leading it on to union with God. Even if you are repeating mechanically, without concentration, still it is the name of God. It may take a much longer time to bear fruit than if you do it, repeat with single-minded devotion. But even if you are doing mechanically, is there will there be any effect? Yes, there will be, because it is repeats the name of God. It will take longer time to bear fruit, but it will have effect. That is why Holy Mother says, Jabat Siddhi. You get everything, the ultimate result, just by repetition of the name of God. Then we come the next part in the prayer, Thy kingdom come. Jesus is telling us that God's kingdom has come already. It is not an earthly kingdom, though some took it literally at the time when Jesus gave this prayer. Some of the people who are following him took it literally, think that they're going to get a kingdom, because the Jews at that time were ruled over by the Romans. They are under the Roman tyranny. So they were trying to get, they're waiting for a deliverer, Messiah. And when he said, Thy kingdom come, they took it literally as a free kingdom for them. Even now, some people explain it literally, thinking as a kingdom where, or a, world without any injustice, poverty, or trouble. But it has never happened. That's like we India saying about Ram Rajya. We speak about Ram Rajya, that the kingdom of Rama, where there is no injustice or poverty. But in the world, there will be always injustice and poverty will be there. As Sri Ramakrishna says, the world is like the curly tail of the dog. It will never become, or everybody won't become rich. Some people will be rich, some people will be poor. There will be injustice. But at the same time, we try to remove those poverty or alleviate the difficulties and remove the injustice, fight against injustice. But things will be there already still. The kingdom preached by Jesus is the kingdom of God's love and compassion. It's a state of God consciousness, experiencing God in one's own heart. That is clear from the conditions he put to enter the kingdom of God. After saying about the kingdom of God, he says in the Gospel of Matthew, we see, For I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. So what is the condition to enter the kingdom of heaven? Your righteousness must exceed the righteousness of others, the scribes and the Pharisees. Ordinary moral living is not enough to enter the kingdom of God. Your mind must be, the heart and mind should be pure. Only then we can feel the presence of God. It's a higher state of consciousness. We may say that we do not feel the presence of God, so how can we realize the kingdom of God? Here and now, Jesus encourages us in trying to realize that, saying that if you have got a little spark, a faint awareness, it will increase if you practice your spiritual disciplines. He encourages saying that this consciousness of God's presence may be like a tiny seed now, but by nurturing it, it can grow into a huge tree. Again, quoting the Gospel of Matthew, he says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is the least of all seeds, so small. But when it is grown, it is the greatest among herbs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and lodge in the branches thereof." So, through faith, love, and prayer, that tiny spark of spiritual awareness of God will grow into a huge conflagration. So, there is nothing to be disappointed saying that we don't feel the presence of God. If you just have a tiny seed, it will grow. If you nurture it, it will grow into a tree. The same way, that small awareness that we have now, if we practice spiritual disciplines, will bring us to the realization of God, the presence of God. God is present everywhere. He is right here within us as our innermost self. That is that one idea repeated again and again in Vedanta. The Supreme Reality pervades the entire universe of living, moving, and non-moving. That's what the Isha Upanishad says. Isha vasimidam sarvam et kinja jagatyam jagat. Everything is pervaded by that Supreme Reality. Sri Ramakrishna puts in the very simple word, the heart of man is the seat of God. So we are all, as Maharaji always used to tell us, we are the walking temples. God is residing within us. Now we come to the next part. Thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Thy will be done. Your will, O Lord, will be done. How do we know whether we are doing God's will? We see many people doing whatever they want to do and say it's God's will. It's by God's will it happened. Actually, we do it for our own selfish purpose or interest, and then we say it's God's will. How can we know it's God's will? Or we can say it's God's will only when we are filled with God. Now, our ego is completely removed and we are filled with God, and then we become instruments in the hands of God, and then we can say, yes, it's God's will. Surrendering our selfish will to the divine will is very hard. We may say, I have surrendered everything to God, everything is happening by God's will. But if you really surrender, it's very, very hard. Every moment we have to be watchful, alert. Am I following God's will or my own selfish interest will? After Girish Ghosh gave Sri Ramakrishna the power of attorney, one day Girish was very happy. Now Sri Ramakrishna has taken all charge. He doesn't have to do anything. Very happy. Then in front of Sri Ramakrishna, while talking with other devotees, he said, yes, I will do that. Sri Ramakrishna corrected. You have to say, if God wills. How can you say, I will do it? Because if you have given your power of attorney to God. No, you can't. That is why then later Girish said, if I knew how difficult it is, I would not have done this. Every moment you had to be alert and watch. I'm doing God's will. It's very, very hard. And often the gifts that God gives is not very pleasant to us. We have to accept even the hardships, blows that we get in the world as gifts of God happening by the will of God. It's very hard to accept it. So Saint Teresa says, his gifts in this world are trials, sorrows, injuries, persecutions, etc. To those he loves more, he gives more of these gifts. To those he loves less, he gives less. The measure of being able to bear a large or small cross is love. So when we say, oh, why did God give me so much of suffering? We have to remember, because God loves us more. If you're having no problem, having a very smooth life, don't think that you got God's blessing. That means God doesn't love you so much. God does not think you are close to Him. So He gives you less. Give us this day our daily bread. What is daily bread? It's not food. It's very silly to think that Jesus is asking for physical bread. No. He is praying for the bread of divine grace. That is the sustenance that we need in spiritual life, the grace of God. Praying that this grace may be bestowed now. Give us this day, now, right now, at this moment, and always. We need God's grace always. God may bestow His grace and may take away His grace, depending upon His will. That's why there is no, you cannot say when we will get God's grace. Sri Ramakrishna says, God has got the nature of a child. There is no condition why or reason why He bestows grace on some and withholds His grace from others. Or again, He may bestow His grace on one person and withdraw after some time. It's all upon His sweet will. We must be ready to surrender and accept whatever He gives us. But there is one thing we have to do. We have to purify our heart. We have to become worthy of God's grace. If our heart is full of impurities, bias, prejudices, hatred, anger, how can we receive God's grace? We must first clean the heart, must be ready, worthy to receive God's grace. God's grace is always coming, but we must prepare ourselves worthy to receive that grace. That is why Sri Ramakrishna says, the breeze of God's grace is always blowing. Set your sails to catch the breeze. That is, do spiritual practices. Become grace worthy. Through spiritual disciplines, through self-effort, we become worthy to receive God's grace when He gives. Forgive our debts as we forgive our debtors. Whatever happens to us in this life, we have to realize that they are the results of our own actions. In actions we done in this life or the previous life, we don't know. But there is no need to blame others. So we are continuously paying off our debts by reaping the results of our actions. No one else is responsible for things going wrong with us, or if whether we suffer. It's nobody else's fault. It's the result of our own actions. So we must be bold enough, brave enough to take responsibility for our actions instead of blaming others. Swami Vivekananda says, we are the makers of our own destiny. So we must be, if we are happy or miserable because of the results of our past actions, we can decide how we want our future. So we are the makers of our own future, our destiny. We must be bold, brave, and take responsibility for our action instead of being like a coward blaming other people. When this idea becomes firm in us, we could forgive those who have apparently wronged us. It's only apparent wrong. It's like actually that wrong is because of the results of our actions. But we will be able to, when this idea is deep rooted in us, we will be able to forgive others. And only by forgiving others and thus purifying our heart can we reach the state of surrender and receive God's grace. So, one who has surrendered his will to God's will and asking for the gift of the daily bread, that is the divine grace, must have already forgiven all the debts. And the last part of the prayer comes, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. How can you think that God will lead us to temptation? It's very hard to think. God is all merciful, helpful. He always wants our good. Why do you think that he will lead us to temptation? And why should Jesus pray like this? Vedanta gives a very uh, prompt answer. Vedanta says, this whole universe is like magic God has created. The universe of creation, preservation, and destruction, everything has come out of God's power, Maya, the delusive power of God. So it is because of Maya that we see the whole thing. And because of Maya, we are fascinated by the external world. We look at the external world. We see the magic, we enjoy the magic, but we are so much caught up with the magic that we forget to look at the magician, the person who is, or we can say, we are so much taken up by the puppet show that we don't look at the person pulling the strings. That is, we can say, that's what he means by when he say, lead us not into temptation. This delusive power, the power of God, Maya, is also called the Divine Mother. And that's why we call Divine Mother Mahamaya, the great illusion. And how can we get rid of this or escape from this Maya, the power of Maya? Only by surrendering to God, only by taking refuge in God. In the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna says, Mama Maya Duratya, Mamave Prapadyande Mayam Etam Tarantide. My Maya is hard to cross. Only those who take refuge in me are able to cross it. It's very hard to escape from the clutches of Maya. We have to take refuge in God. That is why often we see the prayer. Sri Ramakrishna often quoted the prayer of Narada. It says, Narada was praying to Rama, and Rama said, ask for a boon. Then Narada said, I don't want any boons. Only this I pray, that don't delude me by your world bewitching Maya. The Maya is so powerful, it completely deludes even wise people, discerning people. It's very hard. So only through taking refuge in God can we get rid of or escape from Maya. So Saint Teresa says, strive always to walk in love and fear of God. Two things she's saying, love of God and fear of God. Love will quicken our steps. Fear will make us watch our steps to avoid falling along the way. If you love God, you'll be moving fast. You want to reach God quickly. So love will quicken our steps. But fear will make us watch our steps. If you're overconfident, then you may lose. You may stumble and fall down. So fear will make us watch our steps to avoid falling along the way. That is why the prayer lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And when we have escaped from the clutches of Maya, then we realize the self, the Atman within us. And then we can experience the presence of God everywhere, in everything, big and small, good and evil, everywhere we see the presence of God. Then we realize that thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Jesus is not just giving us a prayer, but he is also has given instructions how to pray to God. Prayer is a conversation with God. It's not that we should utter loud prayers or prescribe prayers. When it's a conversation with God, we can use just any word, any as here God is addressed as Father. So as you talk to your father, we talk. As you talk to your mother, as you talk to your friend, we can, depending upon relationship, we can just use ordinary words. Your heart, directly you can speak to God. You don't have, it's not that we have to use prescribed prayers in Sanskrit, in Latin. No, it's just a conversation. It's a heart-to-heart talk conversation with God. And people often want to show off that they are great devotees. They utter loud prayers. But Jesus says, no. When you pray, make sure that nobody sees that you are praying. Again in the Gospel of Matthew, we see him saying, when thou prayest, thou shalt not be as the hypocrites are, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and in the corners of the streets, that they may be seen by men. Verily, I say unto you, they have their reward. But thou, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly. Doing spiritual practices in front of people may bring its own reward, its reward. That's what he says. Standing in the street corners, they have their reward. They will become famous as a holy person. They may have great followings, and in that way they may even acquire great wealth and fame. But they are all obstacles in the spiritual path. Actually, they take you away from God. Spirituality is not for show. It's a very sacred act, and so it is secret. That's why Sri Ramakrishna says the highest devotee, the superior devotee, sattvic devotee, will pray maybe sitting inside the mosquito curtain. People think, oh, because the person hasn't come out of the room, maybe still sleeping, but actually praying. Whereas the Rajasic one will have big show in front of having elaborate rituals and great worship, so that everybody will know that I am a great devotee of God. But true devotee will very quietly pray. That's why Sri Ramakrishna says, pray to God, mane vane kone, in your own mind or when in solitude. If you can't do both that, doesn't matter, in a corner of your house without any show. This idea of God is present within us is according to Swami Vivekananda, one of the main teachings of Jesus. So Swamiji, in his lecture, Christ the Messenger, says, he had no other occupation in life, no other thought except that one, that he was a spirit. He was a disembodied, unfettered, unbound spirit. And not only so, but he, with his marvelous vision, had found that every man and woman, whether Jew or Gentile, whether rich or poor, whether saint or sinner, was the embodiment of the same undying spirit as himself. Therefore, the one work his whole life showed was calling upon them to realize their own spiritual nature. Thank you, and a very holy Christmas to everybody.